Welcome here in the City Hall of Gouda. I begin with a few opening statements and then I will present my formal introduction to you. For the second year in a row, I'm honored to introduce to you Dr. Yaron Brook, President of the Ayn Rand Institute. For one day again, Gouda is the Objectivist capital of the world, for which I'm very proud. Thank you, Yaron, for coming and also for your courage given today's circumstances. Also welcome Jonathan Doan. He will say a few words at the end of our program regarding the upcoming European conference in Berlin in March next year on Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, obviously. I'd like to thank the people of Mandeville Academy for their help in organizing this event. In particular, Harry and Josefina, although they are not yet here, but then I have to say a few things nice to them. They are both amazing and very dear to me, and I'm happy for them that they will get married in June next year, and it pleases me that they chose my birthday as their wedding day. Coincidence, of course. And you all, thank you for coming and showing interest in the application of objectivism to a very important issue, the conflict in the Middle East. So now my formal introduction. Last year's topic was how to be the protagonist of your own life. In other words, how to fight for happiness in your personal future. This concerns you as an individual. This year's topic concerns you as a member of society. I have asked Yaron to talk about probably the most complex conflict in the world, the conflict in the Middle East. And my request was that he will give us his ideas about creating a lasting peace. In other words, how to fight for happiness in the future society. As a thinker and admirer of Ayn Rand and of her philosophy, objectivism, I'm always looking for fundamental insights into complex issues and for fundamental solutions based on creative ideas. And when I have insufficient knowledge myself, I go to a specialist that I respect with the aim of being educated. For today's topic, I expect we will be educated by you. Last year, I myself talked about the functioning of man's mind based on Ayn Rand's epistemology, her theory of knowledge. I presented my model called the frame of reason that consists of 4 blocks. There is the perceptual problem, representing a block at the bottom left of the model, indicating something you perceive in reality, which you evaluate as a problem. I gave the example of a man experiencing a headache. It is something real and perceived, and he considers it as a problem. What he wants is some approach to arrive at a perceptual solution, represented by the bottom right block in the model. He may choose by imitation to take a painkiller, usually then his headache will be gone. But sometimes that approach does not work. Then he goes to a doctor who identifies the cause of the problem, which we call the conceptual problem, represented by the top left-hand block in the model. I suggested last year that the doctor's diagnosis in this case is that he identifies a brain tumor in the man's head. From the identification of the conceptual problem, the doctor analyzes all kinds of treatments, and based on the specific situation, he will decide on the best approach to cure the problem. That is called the conceptual solution, represented by the top right-hand block in the model. So, objectivist thinking moves from the identification of a perceptual problem by abstraction to the conceptual problem, by logic to the conceptual solution, and by action based on the conceptual solution to the concretization of perceptual situation. Start with reality, apply reason with your own rational interest in mind. As we go into the topic of today, how to fundamentally resolve the conflict in the Middle East, in my opinion, the approach should be similar. Start with the problem, abstract to the fundamental nature thereof, apply logic to identify the potential solution on the conceptual level, and act to realize that solution. Again, I like to compare the approach needed for this issue with the approach of going to a doctor. First, one has to identify at the perceptual level why there is a problem. The doctor will ask you what are the symptoms and what are your complaints. So, perception and evaluation. This is the identification of one's personal evaluation of the situation. My personal evaluation of the problem in the Middle East is what I will present to you first. But before that, what the doctor is doing next is comparing the specific situation of some particular patient with the general theory of the functioning of a man's body, both physical and mental. Thus, he applies his theoretical base that he got from university. That theory is fundamental and applied in general. Thus, it is an objective foundation. He will also compare it with his personal experience as a doctor, thus with his practical knowledge. We all know that experience is key in translating general knowledge to practical circumstances to come up with the right diagnosis. And when the diagnosis is there, the doctor will come up with the right approach, which in general consists of a medical operation and after that a recovery treatment so that the result will be lasting. The use of a fundamental objective base is the second part of my introduction. I will come here with the objective foundation as the base to identify the problem that we discussed today. The objective foundation I will find in Yaron's philosophy, which confirms the value of philosophy in general and of objectivism in particular. Yaron wrote an important article called The Roots of War, from which I will give you some important quotes. The translation of the general theory combined with his professional experience to the issue of the conflict in the Middle East, I will leave to Yaron. And also, he will do the reasoning to present us with the approach to the conceptual solution, thus to lasting peace. In this case, he is, in my opinion, the most appropriate specialist. Okay, first I'd like to discuss my personal evaluation. My father is a peaceful man, but when I was a child, we were once near the German border, which was still closed at the time. I remember of that occasion the sudden feeling of hate in my father for Germans. It was based on what he had experienced as a child in the Second World War. That war lasted only 5 years, but the impact was enormous. The conflict in the Middle East exists not for 5 years, but for centuries. Next point. When one of my daughters was 15 years old, she went for the first time to a gala evening here in Gouda, sorry for my emotion, at the St. John Cathedral. She was beautiful, formally dressed for the first time in an evening gown. I dropped her off by car at about 30 meters from the entrance, which she had to walk. When I picked her up at the end of the evening, she told me that during that short walk, a group of young Moroccan guys had hissed and sissed to her and called her a whore. She was really frightened and upset. It made me incredibly angry. And I identified the fact that I was capable of killing when someone you love is deeply hurt and you want to protect her. And then I saw on TV the horror of October 7 last year in Israel. Young people, innocent and vulnerable, were attacked, raped, killed and kidnapped. And I thought, suppose these were my own children. I know what I would have liked to do, but probably wouldn't have done, get into personal action. What would you expect from your government when your daughters and sons would be victimized like that? If some terrorist would be domestic, you would expect the police to capture the terrorist and the court to pronounce the appropriate sentence. When a terrorist comes from abroad, you would expect the government of that particular country to act for justice. But if the government of that other country participate in those acts of terror, you would expect your own government to go to war as a way of protecting you and your loved ones against that terrorist government. If a doctor decides that a medical operation is required to remove a threat to someone's health, any surgeon would tell you that the operation must be focused on the threat, must be carried out swiftly, and must be carried out complete. No surgeon will suggest that the operation may take months in duration or that the partial elimination of some threat as a form of appeasement is sufficient. All the bad cells must be eliminated. And every surgeon knows that collateral damage cannot be avoided. Here in the Netherlands, we also have had some intensive terrorist attack many years ago, the kidnapping of a train. I know a woman who was in that train. She has learned to live with that experience, but it scarred her for the rest of her life. On that occasion, our government did act. The military attacked that train and the kidnappers were killed. That was the appropriate response, in my opinion. In the public discussion of the Middle East conflict now, I hear primarily emotional responses of the use of violence without a proper analysis based on reason. The difference between the initiation of force by terrorists and the retaliation of force by the government is not recognized. The difference between a destructive purpose, firing rockets to a neighboring country, and a constructive approach, building up a prosperous society, is evaded. And the difference between an offensive violence strategy, eliminating Israel, and a defense strategy, building a protection dome, is also neglected. To me, this is all a demonstration of the neglect of the objective use of reason and of the evasion to identify the facts of reality. This explains why I am on the side of Israel, although I do see faults like their accepting a partial destruction of the enemy's potential rather than complete, and now of appeasing to let their enemies recover their strength. As this event today originates in my purpose to explain the value of objectivism, I will now turn to Ayn Rand's general theory in her article, The Roots of War. Of course, she starts with the general context of the problem. In what kind of society and in what kind of political system does war originate, and when does it not? To quote her, laissez-faire capitalism is the only social system based on the recognition of individual rights and, therefore, the only system that bans force from social relationships. By the nature of its basic principles and interests, it is the only system fundamentally opposed to war. Men who are free to produce have no incentive to loot. They have nothing to gain from war and a great deal to lose. Ideologically, the principle of individual rights does not permit a man to seek his own livelihood at the point of a gun, inside or outside his country. Economically, war costs money. In a free economy where wealth is privately owned, the costs of war come out of the income of private citizens. There is no overblown public treasury to hide that fact, and a citizen cannot hope to recoup his own financial losses, such as taxes or business dislocations or property destruction by winning the war. Thus, his own economic interests are on the side of peace. Unquote. She underlies this identification with the reason why, and here is my second quote. The trader and the warrior have been fundamentally antagonists throughout history. Trade does not flourish on battlefields, factories do not produce under bombardments, and profits do not grow on rubble. Capitalism is a society of traders, for which it has been denounced by every would-be gunman who regards trade as selfish and conquest as noble. Let those who actually are concerned with peace observe that capitalism gave mankind the longest period of peace in history, a period during which there were no wars involving the entire civilized world, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Unquote. Politicians now all call for a two-state future as a means to solve the conflict and wars in the Middle East. But I don't think that this is by any means a foundation of peace. It is the roots of the war in the Middle East that have to be fought, from which a future of peace and prosperity can be built. I expect that capitalism is the best social system, according to Objectivism, will have to be aimed for, although I do not know how and what can and when this can be achieved and what steps will be necessary. With this in mind, I will now ask Yaron to present his ideas on the conflict in the Middle East and how lasting peace can be created.
So, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. The events of October 7th were a real shock to, I think, so many people around the world. It was truly horrific, and I'm not going to give you details. I think you've all seen the videos, you've heard the stories. There's no reason to recount everything that happened that day, but it was truly true horror. And yet much of the response of the world, much of the response of commentators was, this is just another skirmish in a long battle, and who knows who started it. You have to go back decades, and there's right on both sides, and there are bad people on both sides, and there are good people on both sides. and a real moral equivocation. Many, as we saw on American campuses, and I think in much of Europe, actually celebrated and sided with the Palestinians on October 7th. I mean, on October 8th, there were already letters at Harvard University in support of Hamas and articulating the case. And again, the story went something like, yes, it was barbaric, it was horrible, but what do you expect from a people that have been oppressed for so many years? This is all Israel's fault. Others, of course, sided with Israel and said, yes, this is really bad. Israel needs to do something about it. But almost always, once Israel did something about it, they argued for restraint and not doing too much and not overreacting. And everybody, I think, is overwhelmed or seems overwhelmed with the complexity of what is going on in the Middle East, right? I mean, there are many players. You've got Hamas in Gaza. You've got the Palestinians in the West Bank. You've got Hezbollah in Lebanon. You've got the Iranians, and you've got all these other Arab countries in the middle. It's not clear exactly what stand they have. And it's just, it's overwhelming. And then people tell you, well, it's 100 years of history. And then you have to go back and understand exactly what happened over those 100 years and exactly the consequences and the sequence of events. And people just give up. They throw up their hands and they give up. It's too complicated. It's too hard. And yet it's not, and it shouldn't be. Because even if you don't know anything about the last 100 years, even if you don't know about the whole configuration of the Middle East and exactly what happens and who the players are and everything else, what you do know and what you can discover fairly quickly is the nature, the fundamental nature, the character of the parties that are at war right now in the Middle East. One can look at Israel. If everybody's visited Israel, people can visit Israel. They can see it, or they can read about it. In Israel today, forget about the last 100 years. Happy to talk about that as well. But in a sense, it's irrelevant. What kind of society is Israeli society today? It's fundamentally Western. It's fundamentally free. People have equal rights in Israel. People have the freedom to speak. They have property rights. They live, relatively speaking, very European lives. Europe in the positive sense, in the sense of we respect people's rights in Europe for the most part. I wish we'd do more than that, but for the most part. There's a general sense of individual liberty in Israel. Even if you're not part of the majority group, if you're not Jewish, you still have property rights, you have freedom of speech, you can still engage in movement and action, and there are very few limitations that are exclusive to you as an Arab, let's say. You actually have one privilege that Jews don't have. You don't have to serve in the military. So there's no conscription imposed on you. You can volunteer, but you're not forced. Jews in Israel are forced to go to the military. 18. But this is true of Christians and Muslims and Druze and any other subsect of people within Israel. They're treated like people are treated in the Western world. They're treated with respect as individuals. Israel's far from a perfect society. Certainly by the standards of objectivism, they're far from a perfect society. They could be more capitalist. They could respect individual rights even more. But given the standard that we have in the world, they're relatively free. Given the standard of history, this is one of the freest countries in history. And in particular, if one looks and contrasts them with, if you will, the other side. Gaza, where the conflict this time erupted, Gaza has been ruled by Hamas basically since 2006. Israel left Gaza completely in 2005. It literally evacuated its own citizens out of Gaza. There were Israeli villages in Gaza. The Israeli military went in and dragged people out of their homes and evacuated them from Gaza. Basically, the idea was, we can't defend you here, so we need you out. If you stay, we have to devote resources to defending you. It's our obligation. We can't do that, so we're going to force you all out. And Israel did that, and it handed over control to Gaza to the Palestinians. Whoever wants to control it, right? Palestinians had a choice on how to do it. There were elections. Hamas won. Nobody expected them to win, but they won. And then there was a civil war between Hamas and the PLO, and they kicked the PLO out, and Hamas dominated the Gaza Strip. By the way, one indication of what was to come happened the day after all the Jewish civilians were evacuated from Gaza, because they had left behind in these villages, they had left behind their lives, but they'd left behind economic assets. They'd left behind small factories. They'd left behind greenhouses, very advanced technologically greenhouses. Gaza is a desert, yet they had grown stuff and they had created agriculture and left the greenhouses. And you would expect that the Palestinians would say, cool, isn't this great? We now get to use the greenhouses these people, built here, because we don't have any. Next day, they went to the greenhouses, they went to factories, and they destroyed them all. They destroyed them all. Which gives you an indication of kind of their inclination. It's not to build, construct, improve. Hamas took over, and now we can judge, okay, what was life like in the Gaza Strip under Hamas? Are individual rights respected? Is there free speech? How do people live in Gaza under this regime of Hamas? Because Israel was out of there. And it turns out, not surprisingly at all, if you know much about Palestinian history, or the Arab world generally, because this is true of the Arab world more broadly, that in Gaza there are no individual rights. People are, Hamas is a dictatorial power. It's authoritarian to the core. It dictates everything. If you oppose them, you are killed. If they don't like you, you are often killed. You see these signs in the United States, maybe you see them in Europe as well. Gays for Palestine. Right? Hamas was known for taking gays to tall buildings and throwing them off the building. The Quran says this is the punishment. So does the Old and New Testament. But the Muslims take it seriously. So no freedom. As a consequence, no economic progress. The people remain poor. To the extent that there was anything, you'll see pictures of Gaza before the war looking quite nice. But anything nice that existed in Gaza was because people in Qatar and people in Iran and Saudi Arabia sent the money. It was nothing was actually produced in Gaza. There was no real economic activity. Again, contrast that to Israel, which is booming, has been booming for years now. Is the, I think second in the world only to Silicon Valley in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation and technology. It's not an accident. A country that basically respects the individual rights of its citizens, basically leaves them alone, allows them to pursue their happiness, is a country in which there will be economic activity and people will achieve real economic success. A country that oppresses its population, you will see no economic progress. Israel is a secular country. Yes, there is a lot of religion, and I think in the news we see more religion than there really is in Israel. But generally, it's a secular country. There is, not as much as I'd like there to be, but there is a separation between state and church, between state and religion. All religions, again, have equal standing before the law. Hamas is a theocracy. It's a theocracy of Islam. It is inspired by the Iranian regime and the role of religion in their lives, and religion dominates every aspect of what they do. In how they governance, again, in their attitude to gays or their attitude to individuals. Israel is a relatively individualistic society. People are treated as individuals. In Gaza, people are treated as members of groups, tribes. Tribal identity is what is important. So even without knowing any history, even without knowing all the details of how Israel was founded and what happened and how it all played out, and every Palestinian leader in a row, and what the Palestinians did over many of those years, all one has to really do is look at the reality as it exists today, accessible to almost any human being on planet Earth today. The information is right there. It's not hard to discover. And what you find is good and evil. What you find is a country that is basically a good country with flaws, and a country that's fundamentally, as a political entity, evil, with nothing positive. Nothing positive. And if you understand it in those terms, then what does Hamas, in order to sustain its authoritarian ways, what does it have to do? What do authoritarians really everywhere ultimately have to do? Because they're failures domestically. The economy of Gaza didn't exist. Again, all the money they got from overseas. What did they do, by the way, with all their money that came? A little bit improved the streets and the buildings a little bit. But what mostly did they do? We know now. They dug tunnels. They bought weapons. They put weapons into tunnels. And the tunnel system is amazing. I mean, in America, you cannot build a tunnel, right? Because of all the environmental regulations and all the rest. It costs $1 gazillion. In Gaza, it was no problem. They dug tunnels everywhere, much faster and much more effectively than they do in any American cities. So, if that's what you're doing, if that's how you're spending the money, if that is what gives you legitimacy, the building of tunnels and the arming of the people, then war is necessary for you. It is the justification for your existence. There's no justification in creating an environment in which your people can thrive. The only justification is hatred of the other, is hatred of Israel. So while, for me, October 7th was truly shocking in its barbarity, and we should remember this was pure barbarism, it was not surprising at all. It was not surprising that it happened. It was just a matter of time before Hamas was going to do something like this. And it wasn't that surprising in terms of the kind of violence that occurred, because that is the kind of culture they've created in Gaza. It's a kind of culture that we haven't seen in the West in probably 300-400 years. Probably the last war that was that barbaric in a sense of just, face-to-face combat and rape and pillage. Probably you have to go back probably to the 18th century or the 17th century. So that is where we are. There are two sides to this conflict. A good side and a bad side. A side of righteousness and a side of evil. A side that is trying to protect itself and defend itself, and a side that wants to kill and slaughter and destroy. Hamas does not offer some kind of long-term vision for how to live side by side with Israel. Palestinian people do not believe in a long-term vision to live side by side to Israel. Their vision is to replace Israel. The river to the sea means exactly what they say. They want a Palestinian state from the river to the sea with no Jews between the river and the sea. And by the way, the river, most of the kids who yelled the river to the sea have no idea what river and what sea, but it's the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It's what constitutes Israel today and what used to be called the West Bank, that whole area. They want the destruction of Israel, and it's not that they say, once we get rid of the Jews, we're going to establish a prosperous, free, a capitalist, wonderful society. No, that's just step one. towards their goal. Remember, these are people are theocratic. They have adopted the idea of Islamism. And the goal ultimately is Sharia law over the entire world. Step 1 is destroy Israel. Step 2, make our way to Europe. It's closer. Ultimately, the U.S. And they believe this. Now, to us, it seems ridiculous. What, they really want world conquest? Nobody wants world conquest. We live in the 21st century. But they do. And they think Allah is on their side, and they think that they can be successful, that they can achieve this. Step 1 is Israel, not the final step. No Hamas, no Hezbollah ultimately are not nationalist movements. Both Hamas and Hezbollah ultimately are international movements. These are movements dedicated to world domination. Again, as ridiculous as that might sound, just all you have to do is read their charter. They modify their charters. Hezbollah's original charter talked about Sharia law over the whole world, and then they've watered it down because they tried to become a political force within Lebanon. So they watered it down to present themselves more as nationalists. But ultimately what they want is what Iran wants, what's in the constitution of Iran, which is the spreading of Islam on a global scale. Well, we can talk about Saudi Arabia. Ask me in the Q&A of Saudi Arabia, because we can go in a lot of directions in this talk. There's a lot of content we can cover. So the question fundamentally is, what do you do? Because if somebody really wants to kill you, there's nothing to negotiate. Oh, you can take half my life. Just don't take it all. I mean, there's nothing to compromise over. It's not that the Palestinians today want a Palestinian state. Everybody talks about a two-state solution. But the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, and they've never wanted a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution from the river to the sea. A one-state solution with no Jews in it. Or if there are Jews in it, it's a small minority, and they are treated as second-class citizen as the Quran dictates. How do you negotiate? How do you come to terms? How do you establish peace with people who want to kill you? Who want to kill you. This is their goal, this is their aim, and this is what their religion demands of them. And it's not just the Palestinians. We just heard about a ceasefire with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a Lebanese entity. It's different than Hamas because they are Shiites. Hamas are Sunnis. They are directly linked to Iran. Hezbollah was established by Iran in the early 1980s. Again, this is part of an Iranian goal of domination. Hezbollah allied with Hamas because they have a common enemy, not because they like each other or they share goals. Again, Sunnis and Shiites don't particularly like each other, but they know they both hate the enemy, which are the Jews in the Middle East. Hezbollah is in the same position. They will not be satisfied as long as there is a state of Israel. They will not be satisfied as long as, there is an Israeli state. It's not that they want a smaller Israeli state, or they want a few pieces of the Galilee, and then they'll be happy, and then there'll be peace for everybody. Hezbollah's goal is to dominate Lebanon and to establish Sharia law over Lebanon, which is hard for them because they have been historically a minority in Lebanon. They haven't been a majority. So they're fighting a battle within Lebanon. And then they would like to see Israel wiped out as part of this, again, global ambition. How do you sit down with Hezbollah and negotiate terms when this is their goal, which they have not changed and they have not modified and will not change and will not modify because this is part of their worldview. This is part of their philosophy. And then, of course, behind Hamas and Hezbollah and behind almost all the terrorism in the world today sits the state of Iran. The state of Iran, which is a state created with this mission in mind. It's in its constitution. It's in the very nature of the state. And remember, Iran has, I don't have many examples in history where you see this. Iran has a supreme leader. Not just a leader, but a supreme one. So it is a dictatorship. It's an authoritarian state. It is a theocracy, again, dedicated to a particular goal, the spread of these ideas on a global scale. As long as Iran is there and has money because it has oil, it funds all these other elements in the Middle East to keep promoting this ideology going. And not just in the Middle East. They fund a lot in Europe. They fund all over the world. They're funding ideological allies in order to spread these ideas. How do you establish peace with Iran? How do you establish peace with Hezbollah and Hamas? And the answer is you can't. Not as long as they hold this ideology. That is, one cannot have peace with one's enemy. The enemy has to stop being the enemy for peace to exist. So the only way to have peace, what do we call it, lasting peace, in the Middle East, is to not have an enemy anymore. The Iranian people are not necessarily Israel's enemy. Some are not. I would even argue that under the right circumstances, the Palestinian people as a whole are not necessarily Israel's enemy. They are right now. But that's not necessity. There's nothing in the genes or the blood or the ethnic group that necessitates hostility. They are individuals just like anybody else. But right now, they're individuals guided by a destructive, horrific, evil ideology. So that ideology has to be defeated. But then there's a question, how do you defeat an ideology? How do you change people's minds about ideas? How do you get them to reject the old ideology and embrace something new? Because what they need is something new. If the Palestinians were more like the Israelis, if they recognized the value of the individual, if they upheld secular government and secular society, if they wanted prosperity and they were willing to recognize the value of markets, peace would be relatively easy. How do you get them to change when they are stuck on an evil ideology that is destructive and is the opposite of all these things? I mean, I know a lot of people who write and argue constantly. You can't do it. It's impossible. You can't win an ideology. You can't beat an ideology out of people. And yet it turns out you can. It's happened before. I mean, you mentioned going to the German border. I don't know when this was. I assume in the you were 6, so in the 1960s. And there was still some hate and fear and anger towards Germany. But Germany already by then was a completely different place. I mean, for all intents and purposes, there were no Nazis in Germany anymore. The Nazis had been defeated, not just militarily, but the Nazis had been defeated ideologically. The ideology of Nazism was gone. Now, we can talk about whether it might come back, but it was gone. How did that happen? How did the German people just give up an ideology that they were willing to die for? I mean, many Germans died fighting for Nazism. And you know, people could tell you stories about it's only a small minority of Germans were really Nazis. I call bullshit. It's just not true. I mean, it's a small number of the population that joined the Nazi Party. But the Nazi Party could not have done what it had done without massive support from an overwhelming majority of the German population. Whether they were members of the Nazi Party or not. They, you know, just think of all the soldiers that pulled those triggers. What about Japan? World War II again, more current history, right? World War II, Japan was dominated by a collectivistic, ethnic-driven ideology that basically said the Japanese was superior to everybody else in the world. They were driven by the idea that Japan was the most important, valuable place on planet Earth, and they would dominate the rest of the world. They would dominate China. They would dominate Asia. Asia was theirs. Europe was the Germans, and they had divided up the world between the two master races, if you will. And they really believed in this. I mean, remember the number of kamikaze pilots who were willing to fly their airplanes and kill themselves in the name of the emperor, in the name of an ideology. Suicide bombing was not invented by Islam. Japanese were doing it. And they were, it seemed that they did it with a passion and a focus. It seemed brainwashed. How do you get that out of them? How do you change it? And yet, Japan today is an amazing place. People there are incredibly friendly, very much more individualistic than a lot of other places around the world. You know, nobody's flying airplanes into building in the name of Japan. The emperor's there, but it's symbolic and kind of cute, and everybody goes sees the palace to see the beautiful gardens and the beautiful buildings, but nobody takes the emperor too seriously in Japan. Nobody's dying for the emperor. The idea of Japanese imperialism was defeated. The idea of Japanese, superiority was defeated. How? By being defeated. So two things happened. And you need to do two things in order to defeat an ideology. One, you need to defeat it in the field of action. You need to defeat it militarily. You need to crush it. So there's no doubt about next time we'll do better. One of the reasons we had a World War II is because the Germans were not crushed in World War I. So Hitler and others who returned from the battlefields of World War I went back to Germany and said, we could have won this. We will win this. We weren't defeated. Our political leaders betrayed us. Our generals maybe betrayed us, but we could have won this, and we should have won this. And the ideology only got stronger of German nationalism, not weaker, because they were not defeated. They might have been humiliated, but not defeated. They weren't brought to their knees. They didn't get the message that they had no chance of winning. After World War II, the Germans got the message. And by the way, part of the reason, and I know this is controversial today in Europe, in the US, everywhere, one of the reasons Dresden was flattened was to make sure they got the message. It was explicitly Churchill's goal, to break the German spirit completely. And if you've seen pictures of what Germany looked like at the end of World War II, it was just destroyed. It was flattened. Almost every German city was flattened. And as a consequence of that, the Germans got it. We can't win. Something we did was wrong. Something about the ideology we had was bad. Maybe we don't get it exactly, but we know this is not workable. We just die if we follow this pursuit. And a second thing is that in those days, the Allied forces had a certain pride and a certain, confidence in the ideology they represented. So we're not just defeating you in the name of defeating, we're defeating you in the name of, maybe they don't call it, nobody called it capitalism or freedom, but they talked about freedom, they talked about democracy, they talked about the idea of individual sovereignty, they talked about the negatives of what the Nazi ideology held. They attacked the Nazi ideology as evil. There was no qualms about calling it evil. Nobody said, well, there's some good things about Nazis, but we don't want to paint too big of a brush. No, Nazism was evil. It was done with. It was finished. Dustbin of history. Nobody was interested in it. So the West defeated them militarily, crushed them, and challenged them intellectually, that is, philosophically, intellectually, basically called them what they were, which is an evil ideology that the West would have nothing to do with. And that combination works. In Japan, the same combination worked. Every city in Japan, every major city in Japan was firebombed. That is, it went up in smoke. We'll get to questions in a minute. They were all firebombed. Hundreds of thousands of people died way before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1 million people were homeless in Tokyo by the end of the war. 1 million people. And then, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki put an end to the war, but they put an end to the idea that the Japanese were special. It put an end to the idea that the Japanese could conquer the world. it definitively said, no, you failed. Whatever ideology you had, it was rotten and you failed. These guys, stronger, more powerful, more successful than you are. But that wasn't all. Then the United States came in and said, and here are some ideas by which you can build a better society. That is all wrong. Here's something better. And, I don't know if you know this, but Japan's constitution that they have today was written over a weekend by General MacArthur and his aide. They sat down, they wrote a constitution. They copied a lot of it from the American Constitution. They actually phrases that they just copied straight from the Declaration of Independence. The American Declaration of Independence is in the Japanese Constitution. The idea, for example, that we all have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not in the American Constitution. That's in the Declaration. But it is in the Japanese Constitution. And then they basically went to the Emperor of Japan and said, this is your new Constitution, sign here. They didn't ask him. They, in a sense, this is how you're going to live. You don't have the right to choose your own path moving forward. What you did is so horrific that you don't get to choose. We're going to choose for you. And here's an alternative. It's an alternative that has led Japan to thrive, to do very well, and to very much change its ideas. So that's a combination. Defeat on the battlefield, but a crushing defeat on the battlefield. And then an alternative, providing the people with an alternative. Now, the first part of this, the crushing defeat on the battlefield, is not pretty. It's not nice. It's not something we want to watch on television being done. Maybe we should be thankful there was no television or not significant television during World War II, because maybe we wouldn't have tolerated what actually happened during the war, even towards the Nazis. But the fact is, today, anything you do is on television. But the reality is that in order to have lasting peace, the Palestinians have to change their ideology. Iran is going to have to change its ideology. And the only way that can happen is first if they're crushed on the battlefield. Israel's done a little bit of crushing, but it's far from what could have done and should have done. It's taken way too long. It's appeased at every turn. And can you imagine bombing Dresden into oblivion and supplying it at the same time with water, electricity, internet connection, and food? But that's what Israel's doing. Israel, by the way, supplies them with water and supplies them with electricity, and they have internet connection, and they have cell phone connection because of Israel. And yet they're bombing them at the same time. It's insanity, in my view. People you bomb, you should not be feeding. If you want to feed them, don't bomb them. But if you're bombing them, don't feed them. Otherwise, you're sending a complete mixed message and a message of weakness. So to win, Israel needed to truly crush the Palestinian people. And the war here, and here again, I'm more controversial than most, the war here is not against Hamas. Hamas is the particular, it's a political leadership of the Palestinian people. This is who the Palestinian people want. Every poll shows they support Hamas. They voted for them in the last Palestinian election, which happened in 2005, a long time ago. Granted, they won a majority. This is the government of the Palestinian people. It's not just some external group that came in and took over. This is who they are. Palestinians need to be brought to their knees. In other words, they need to understand that they can never defeat Israel militarily. That whatever ideology they have today is not an ideology for victory. The Islamist ideology is one of defeat. And then they need to be offered an alternative. And here you come up against multiculturalism. The West has to be able to say, your way is bad, it's evil, it's wrong. Islamism, this interpretation of Islam, we're not expert in Islam, I'm not going to tell you what Islam means or doesn't mean. This version of Islam, world domination, Sharia law, treating women the way you treat women, treating gays the way you treat gays, this is unacceptable in a civilized world. This ideology is evil. It's like the Nazis. It's like Japanese imperialism. It needs to disappear from the planet. You need to say that. Can't say that anymore. too politically correct. There's no good and evil. Can't talk in those terms. Good ideology, bad ideology. By what standard? But it's a combination of those two things that have to happen. That is what leads to long-term peace. And there's no reason there cannot be long-term peace in the Middle East. There's no reason why the religion of Islam cannot be, call it moderated, reformed, enlightened, just like Christianity was. This was a Christianity, pretty barbaric religion. 300, 400, 500, 600 years ago. In the 30-year War, which was not far from here, and participated, Netherlands was part of it. A third of the German population was killed by Germans. Why? Because one side was Catholic, because one side was Protestant, and they hated each other. They killed their own people, their own families. A third of the entire population, maybe per capita, the bloodiest war in human history. All over religion. So it's not like there's a religion of peace somewhere. There is no such thing as a religion of peace. Just read the Old Testament if you're not convinced of that, right? So I'm not going to tell the Muslims they can't happen to them what's happened to Christianity, which is pacification. But the militant form it takes today is unacceptable, will not be accepted, and the West has to defeat it, to crush it, to eliminate it, if we're going to have peace. Once that's done, and once we offer an alternative, not offer an alternative in terms of negotiation, but offer an alternative because this is the alternative you're going to have, that is the way you achieve peace. Peace comes, as the quote from Ayn Rand emphasized, peace comes when we start treating each other as individuals, not as members of tribes. Peace comes when we start treating each other as traders, where we can gain from one another through trade. Peace comes when all parties acknowledge the value of individual human life and acknowledge the fact that individuals have rights, that individuals should be free. As long as we don't have that, it's almost impossible. It is impossible to achieve peace. We can negotiate temporary ceasefires. We got one right now in Lebanon. It'll buy Israel maybe 10 years. It's not insignificant because Israel's devastated Hezbollah as much as it has. But it won't go away. The problem hasn't been solved. It's just kicking the can further down the road, as we're very good in the West at doing in almost every realm of our lives. God forbid we deal with reality and actually deal with the problems that we face. We just pretend it doesn't exist and kick them down the road. Same thing will happen in Gaza, I expect. Some deal will happen where the Palestinians are not defeated, and therefore it's just a matter of how do they reform, how do they rearm, how do they initiate war again in the future. So I'm not very optimistic about achieving lasting peace in the Middle East because I think we in the West are way too weak. We don't have the backbone that we had 70 years ago. We don't have the confidence that our system is actually of value and will actually lead to lasting peace. Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take the West, Israel representing the West in the Middle East, but it's going to take the West to recommit to its own ideas, recommit to the value of its own ideas, and recommit to fighting evil ideologies that threaten it and defeating them, and then advocating for the good in the same time. I think Ayn Rand is an important tool, if you will, maybe the most important thing of the 20th century that can reignite that sense of value that we see in our own culture, in our own civilizations, in our own values, and give us the kind of backbone, give us the moral certainty to go out and fight the fight that needs to be fought, because it's not over, and it's only going to expand as if Israel doesn't win it all. Thank you. All right, we'll take questions. Yeah.
What do you actually see happening in the coming years, maybe decades?
So what do I see happening in the coming years and decades? Look, I think what Israel has done to both Hamas and Hezbollah is a lot. They've degraded their ability to wage war against Israel significantly. Hezbollah and Hamas are really no longer, at least for the next few years, a threat to Israel. Yes, they might still commit terrorist attacks here and there, but they can't do anything on the scale of October 7th. They can't do anything on the scale of what they did before October 7th. People forget, before October 7th, every few days missiles would be launched on Israel. And luckily, Israel knew how to play defense. They could knock the missiles out of the air, so not a lot of people died. But the intention was to kill a lot of people almost on a daily basis. That won't happen. The missiles are gone. The ability to project those missiles are gone. So Israel is likely to face a situation where the threat level is decreased significantly. I would also say Iran has been shown to be a paper tiger. For most of us, that was not surprising. Iran has always been weak, but for a lot of people, it was surprising. And maybe for the Iranians themselves, they discovered how weak they really are. They thought they had these amazing Russian weapon systems, and it turns out that those amazing Russian weapon systems can be destroyed very, very easily by a modern, technologically advanced army. Maybe we could learn something about other conflicts from that. So I think Iran is weakened significantly. So I think you probably bought a decade of relatively quiet. And then the real question is what happens to Iran? I think Iran is the key player in the Middle East. I can imagine an optimistic scenario, right? The optimistic scenario is over the next few years, local hostility to the regime in Iran increases. And ultimately, there's a revolution in Iran. And they kick out the mullahs, and they establish a pro-Western, Western-friendly regime in Tehran. And then the whole Middle East changes, and Israel has a shot because then, the financial resources don't go to Hamas and Hezbollah, and those organizations are finished. And maybe then the Palestinians wake up and say, we're on our own. We better cut a deal. Right? We better do something. We better change in some fundamental way. So defeat could come from the Iranian people. And in a sense, that's the most bloodless way in which some of the issues get resolved. If the Iranian people rebel against the Islamist regime and establish a decent country, then I think you could get real change in the Middle East. So that's what I think is going to happen. Lebanon is a powder keg. It's hard to exactly say what's going to happen there with Hezbollah, partially because of the internal politics within Lebanon. But the Lebanese were very happy to see Israel completely degrade Hezbollah and destroy Hezbollah because that was their only hope of reasserting control over their country. The Shiites, again, are not a majority, and they used to be a small minority. They're a bigger minority today. But nobody else had the will or the military resources to take them on. Now that they've been degraded, you might see a renewed civil war in Lebanon where they attempt to try to crush Hezbollah, finish the job so that they can go back to normal. I mean, remember, Lebanon has not been a normal country since the early 1970s. Right? It's been in a civil war or in some kind of mayhem since the early 1970s. Before that, anybody know what Lebanon was called? Switzerland of the Middle East, Beirut was called the Monaco. Beirut's a beautiful, beautiful city. Lebanon is a beautiful, beautiful country, and it used to be, almost 50% Christian, and the Christians have all left. So now today it's somewhere between 20 to 30% Christian, if that, because they've all left the Christian Arabs and because of the civil war and because how horrible Lebanon became, and they had options. So who knows exactly how Lebanon plays out. But again, I think Hezbollah as a military force threatening Israel, for the most part, is gone. It doesn't mean they can't rebuild, but for a decade, it's gone.
When Iran is the other conflicts, the 6-day, 7-day war, the Yom Kippur, it was before the Ayatollahs took power, before, with Brook, the students as well. It's funny how the history repeats well on the campuses. But if we run, there will be another power in the Middle East. I think.
So, and here it goes back to the comment before about Saudi Arabia. It really is a question about what is going to happen with Saudi Arabia. There is no other power in the Mediterranean. It is Egypt. Egypt is armed to the teeth right now. It's got a massive military. It's got very advanced weapon systems. The only good thing you could say about Egypt right now is that all its military is basically American weapon systems. So they couldn't launch a war against Israel without American support because they would have no spare parts. They would have no ammunition. They couldn't fight the war. They're completely armed by the United States. Same is true, by the way, of the Saudis. The Saudis have weapon systems. They're all American weapon systems. But really here the question is, what is the goal of the Saudi regime? What does the Saudis actually want? And the reality is I don't know. Right? MBS, who is a crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who will be the king of Saudi Arabia when the current king dies, is a young man who claims to be Western, who claims to wants to bring Western values to Saudi Arabia. He's still going to stay king. It's not exactly consistent with Western values, I would argue. And he's still pretty brutal in some respects. But there is definitely a loosening up and a kind of westernization of certain aspects of Saudi life. Although, I met a Saudi girl yesterday? 2 days ago. 2 days ago in Düsseldorf in Germany. And she was like, she just got out of Saudi Arabia and she's like, I'm never going back. It's a horrible place. Now, again, particularly for a woman, it's just a horrible place to live and to be. So how serious he is? And then the question also is, let's say he is serious, will he live? Right? Sadat was serious, and Sadat was killed very quickly after signing a peace deal with Israel. So will MBS survive? What are the other forces within the Middle East? Now, here again is this point. If Israel defeats the Islamists locally, others will pay attention. And they say, we don't want that. And they'll have to change their minds. People don't like supporting a losing ideology. You remember when there were terrorist attacks regularly in Europe 10 years ago, 10 years ago? It was just regular, cars being driven through crowds, subways attacked, and it was regular. And when was this happening? It was happening when ISIS was successful. ISIS had conquered ground. They had taken over parts of Syria, taken over parts of Iraq, and they were establishing the caliphate. And when you're successful like that, a lot of people are willing to die for your cause. But when ISIS basically was, for the most part, destroyed, hasn't been completely destroyed, but for the most part destroyed, had to give back the land, disappeared as an inspiring force of victory, terrorism declined dramatically. Now, it's not gone away, and you can see the crowds all over Europe of Islamists who have not gone away, but their willingness to die for the cause has gone down dramatically because the cause doesn't look that exciting anymore. Brits, and I don't know if you guys had this phenomenon here, but people all over Europe were volunteering to go and fight with ISIS. They were converting to Islam and moving over there because it was an exciting ideology. Well, if you defeat it, it's not exciting anymore. So a lot of it depends on how the Saudis and the common people interpret what Israel does. And again, to the extent that Israel doesn't crush its enemy, and it hasn't completely, to that extent, they always think, oh, there's hope. Next time we'll do it better. Next time we'll beat them. Next time we'll get them. So if Iran goes away, there's a possibility that Saudi Arabia takes its place or another country takes its place. But again, it buys time, right? Right now, Iran is at the forefront of all the terrorism, really globally, in terms of Islamic terrorism. And if that's out of the picture, it'll take them a long time to reorganize around another state sponsor. Again, and as you defeat them and offer an alternative, you're just buying time. You're not doing more than that.
Yeah. What do you mean when you mention the term Islamism? Could you distinguish that from Islam as a religion and explain how it's more like things like this Shintoism and the Nazism?
Yeah, I mean, Islamism is we called, after 9/11, when kind of these ideas, I think, really bubbled to the surface and became evident in the West, you know, I think somebody at the Ayn Rand Institute coined the term Islamic totalitarianism. Right? So it's not just any Muslims. These are Muslims who want to use their religion to justify totalitarian control over society. They want every aspect of society driven by Islamic law, by Sharia law. Everything has to be dictated through that. And again, all religions have gone through phases where they believed in that. We will establish a theocracy where everybody has to do, you know, what the specific holy text says you should do. But, you know, you can imagine other forms of Islam where, just like Christianity, the idea is there's a separation between state and religion. And Islam is something you practice in your home, practice in the mosque, but it doesn't affect public life. It doesn't affect the way the state is run. It doesn't affect governance. People are treated as individuals, and you treat people of other religions as equal in terms of the fact that they're human beings. Sharia law does not allow for that. The Quran does not allow for that. But really, neither does Catholic doctrine, if you go back long, you know, far enough, right? I mean, when the Catholics started to dominate the Roman Empire, when they became the official religion of the Roman Empire, there were significant voices within the Catholic Church saying we need to kill all the Jews. The Jews are in the front. They did, you know, they saw Christ. He was right there, and they turned their back on them. Therefore, they are evil, and we must wipe them out. And St. Augustine comes forward and says, no, we shouldn't kill all the Jews. We need to keep them alive. We need to keep them alive so that we see their suffering. We see their pathetic lives, and it reminds us of what happens when we turn our backs to Christ. And, you know, the origins of anti-Semitism are all over, you know, the early Catholic Church. Now, Catholicism has evolved since then, right? It's rejected a lot of those doctrines, particularly in the last 50, 60 years, less so before World War II. But they've rejected all those doctrines. Islam needs to reject the doctrines that lead to the same conclusion. So you can have an Islam that is not involved in governance. You can have an Islam that is not involved in running the state. You can have an Islam the way people just believe. Now, to the extent that people hold their religion consistently, to the extent that people, put faith above reason, to that extent, there are going to be problems. What in the West we have done is we've relegated that space to a relatively minor part of life. So the damage is limited, somewhat limited. And when it expands, the damage gets worse. So in America, when they talk about doing away with separation of church and state, as some people in America are talking about today, that damage is expanding. So religion, to the extent that it negates reason, is always damaging. But if we can limit that damage to the individual itself rather than to millions and the whole political system, then we've moved a long way towards a more peaceful coexistence. And Islamism is the idea that, no, Islam has to dominate all aspects of life and for everybody. And if you're not a Muslim, okay, you can still live. You have to pay a special tax. We treat you differently. You're a second-class citizen. There is definitely first and second-class citizens in Islam, just like, again, they were under Christianity. Yeah.
You said you have, you started with the nature of people, huh? And you said then you have the secular and the capitalism, and you have the theocracy, and that is, roughly speaking, the two. Huh? And then within that, there's a lot of variation. Yep. And then you said it is very difficult to change the nature of people. You cannot crush out if you're either in the one or in the other. And then I think from a secular point of view, of course, the values that we defend in the West, that we are very proud of, and we have a foothold, in my opinion, in Israel with that. Huh? Yeah. So in the middle of the whole Islamic, we have a Western thinking or Western philosophy as a foothold, which I think is great. But now, to your last points, this is very disturbing to me, and I realize it myself. Jan was talking about American or Mexican or whatever, the Islamic influence on the street. I also experienced that. And what you said is, in the past, we used to have a backbone, and we used to come out and help Israel and defend our values and go for it. And now it is like things are turning upside down. It is and I'm afraid, in all fairness, and this is my own conclusion, but I'd like to hear your reflection on it, that people are not aware of what is going on, what kind of an indoctrination, or not indoctrination, but infiltration, what is going on. And if we don't realize, if we don't understand, if young people, if the current people in the West do not understand what's going on, basically underlaying, to me, that's a real threat. And
yeah, but it's much worse than what you're saying. Much worse, because the reality is today, the young people in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, are not only taught, they're not really taught much about what goes on in the world and what they represent and so on, but they're taught that the West is bad. They're taught that the West is sinful. We're colonialists. We're an empire. There's nothing special about the West. There's nothing unique about us. There's nothing good about it. Capitalism is evil, exploitative, nasty. I mean, find me young people out there at universities who are pro-capitalist or even know what it is. They just don't exist. I was at Cambridge yesterday, Cambridge University in England, and I said a few things pro-capitalism, and the place just blew up. They thought I was crazy. Really? You know, they don't know anything, but what they do know is we are bad. We are bad.
so that is infiltration.
Well, it's not infiltration from the outside. It's an infiltration from within. We've done it to ourselves, right? It's not that the Islamists have come here and told us, no, you guys are bad. No, we, based on our philosophies, based on our philosophers, based on ideas that have come out of the West, are anti-ourselves. So if Western civilization is built, in my view, Western civilization is built on three ideas, three, pillars. They're all related. It all comes from really one idea, but the three related ideas. The first one is the efficacy of reason. We learn about the world through reason. It is our mind, our senses and our mind. That's how we know what we know. Science, right? It's about reasoning, and it's about understanding the world, and we have the capacity to do that. Well, not if you read Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx, and the postmodernists, all Westerns, didn't mention a single non-Western philosopher. Reason is out. Reason doesn't tell you about real reality, and who cares about reason? It's the emotion, the sense of being in one, or whatever Hegel's nonsense actually means, right? And the postmodernists tell you there is no truth. So to hell with reason. You can't discover truth because there is no truth. There is no such thing. The whole concept is out. So if the West rests on reason, I think it does, and the West comes to maturity in the Enlightenment, which is the age of reason, which is the rediscovery of reason after centuries of religion and going by a book. And I mean, they even treated Aristotle and the Greeks as religious texts, right? They read them as if they were religious texts because that's the only mentality they had. You read a book, it's all true, you follow. And yet, in the Enlightenment, it was suddenly, whoa, let's look around, let's discover, let's figure out what the truth is. That's being undercut. Second pillar is individualism. Only the individual can reason. There's no group consciousness. There's no group consciousness floating around here. We don't think in groups. We think in individuals. And it's the individual's life that has sanctity. It's the individual that must be protected. Go back to John Locke and the concept of individual rights, which is celebrated in the Enlightenment and brought about the creation of the United States of America. But really, the whole of modern Europe is a testament to John Locke and these kind of ideas, right? And yet, does anybody believe in individual rights anymore? Anybody ever talk about individual rights? The right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Nobody talks about it. Even in America, nobody talks about it. It's in the Declaration of Independence, but you learn that in history, and then you forget it, and then you go on in life. But if you follow the presidential debates, nobody ever mentions the word rights. Partially because to have power, you have to violate people's rights, and everybody wants power. And that's what's important. So the second pillar, individualism, now in America at least, and I think this is true in Europe as well, we become tribal. You know, you either belong to the left or you belong to the right, and you hate each other because they're on the left, and the truth is irrelevant. It's which tribe do I belong to? It's all tribalism and collectivism, and individualism is out the window. And then on top of that, you have the whole multicultural movement, right? Which is a collectivistic movement. It basically categorizes people as groups. Every culture is equal, right? So we tell ourselves, and we invented this. Nobody imported this. Like immigrants who come to Europe come here because they want a better life. And then they come here and we tell them, yeah, but your culture is just as good as ours. Your barbaric culture that you escaped from Africa, from the Middle East, just as good as ours. You can't say one culture is better than the other. And they go, oh, okay, we didn't realize that. So maybe we should bring our culture here. I mean, imagine a West that said, you want to come here? Great, we love immigrants. You have to assimilate. You have to become us. You have to become European. And here's what it means to be European. You have to respect reason. You have to respect individuals. And finally, the third pillar of the Enlightenment or of Western civilization is political liberty, political freedom, which of course rests on the concept of individual rights. It rests on the fact that as individuals, we are free to pursue our values, free of coercion, free of force. But nobody even knows that. Yeah, we have this vague notion of democracy is a good thing. So we give everybody the right to vote, and then they can vote to take rights away from a minority. And what's the smallest minority Ayn Rand pointed out? What's the smallest minority group? The individual. Individual is the smallest minority. And we're very good at taking rights away from the individual. So we become collectivists. You know, we become irrationalists. And we become, you know, democracy is not exactly what political liberty, political freedom really is about. Because democracy needs to be limited by something so it prevents the majority from overwhelming the minority. We don't have that anymore. We become much more democratic than we should be or have been. And now democracy is like God, right? If you go on a debate or you go on a stage somewhere and you say, democracy not so good, God, they'll stone you to death. So the problem in the world today is us. It's not them. If we understood our value, understood what we're about, understood how good our ideas were or can be, then it's easy to deal with them. It's easy. Putin is nothing. He's nothing. The only thing that gives Putin power is the fact that he has confidence, or projects confidence, and that we don't know what the hell we're doing. I mean, in America, a lot of the people on the right in America think Putin is their friend because he's religious, he's strong. You ever seen him without a shirt? He's masculine, you know, and they love him because he's one of them. And they can't say, no, Putin represents evil because there's no such thing as evil. We're all the same. And, or you know, Putin doesn't represent the West because they can't define the West. They have no concept of what the West is. So none of these bad actors in the world, North Korea, the fact that anybody cares about anything happening in North Korea is a joke. They should have been, I mean, that regime should have been destroyed a long time ago. As soon as they started making threats and building nuclear bombs, they should have been destroyed. Why are they even around? And Iran could go like this. You saw what Israel did to it. It barely challenged itself. You know, so China's the only one that you could even imagine being a threat. And if you took care of Russia, North Korea, and Iran, China would behave itself. You know, China would toe the line and they would change completely because they would be afraid.
You just mentioned Putin. I'm involved daily in debates with pro-Putin right-wingers.
God.
So do you have any advice? Because they often use Israel as a talking point. So either it is, well, if you support Ukraine, why don't you support Gaza? Or something of that effect. Do you have like a quick rebuttal to that?
Yeah, I support the people who advocate for freedom, which is Israel and Ukraine. Ukraine is not perfect. It's not as good as Israel, but it's pretty damn close. If you win Ukraine and if you've been a Kiev before the Putin's invasion, it was striving to be Western. It was really making an effort to try to become like a Western country. And the young people there, they wanted to become part of Europe. That was their dream. That's what they wanted, what they still want. So, no, I mean, you support, you see, they have this perspective of supporting the underdog, right? It's not about freedom. It's not about values. It's about who's on top and who's on bottom. So if you support Israel, they're the strong ones. You should support Russia because they're the strong ones. If you support Ukraine, they're the weak ones. Then you should support the weak ones over there, which is Gaza. So no, I support those fighting for freedom, fighting for a semblance of Western values. And Ukraine does, and Israel does, and Russia is the opposite of that. Russia is the enemy of everything Western.
How do you explain people who support Russia but Gaza as well? What is their view?
Russia and Gaza.
Yeah, you also have those.
They just hate the West. Right? No, they're just haters. Right? So they hate the West. So that makes, see, that's the most logical. That's the most consistent position to have because Russia and Gaza are similar. They're both anti-Western, anti-individual, anti-progress and capitalism. They're both just the might of the muscle. They're just about material might. So I see that much more than I see the other combinations.
And one more about the Middle East. You mentioned a couple of countries, but could you also talk about Turkey? What would be their role if
Yeah.
falter?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey's such a complicated place because on the one hand, Turkey's a member of NATO. Pretty amazing. Turkey's a member of NATO. It has American nuclear weapons in Turkey. They have basically the best American weapon systems in the world. They have F-35s, and they have a lot of American weapon systems. On the other hand, Erdogan is a committed Islamist. Now he's an Islamist of a different type. He's less militant than others. He does not believe yet that he has the power, militarily and otherwise, to actually use physical force to get his way. He's trying to use soft power, what's called in diplomacy soft power. He also would love to join the EU, right? So he doesn't want to alienate the Europeans too much, but he's realized now that he's never going to join the EU. So he's willing to be a little bit more aggressive on the other side. But he also needs America because he's discovered what the Russian weapon systems are worth, nothing. And so he still wants to buy weapon systems from the Americans. So he's on this balancing act. I mean, this is the funny thing is, it's funny, it's tragic. The reality is that the enemies of the West are unbelievably weak. Russia's incredibly weak. Turkey's incredibly weak. It depends on America, right? North Korea and Iran are barely significant, right? They're all weak. Hamas is weak. Hezbollah is weak. They're all weak, right? And the West is incredibly strong in comparison. And the only thing that prevents us from winning is us. And in that sense, the number one enemy of the West is the West. The number one enemies of the West are the universities. What is being taught in the universities, which undermines who we are, undermines the values we represent, undermines capitalism and liberty and all of these things and reason, most importantly, science even. But indeed, the most significant enemies of the West over the last 200 years have been the West. Came out of the West, right? Communism and fascism. Those came out of Western thinkers. So nothing has come from anywhere else that's a threat to the West. Nothing. Except what we produce. So what's happening today in the universities is we're producing, on the left, if you will, the woke culture, and on the right, this kind of national conservatism, call it, or Christian conservatism, as some call it. Again, these are forces that scare me a lot more than Muslims, Russians, or, North Koreans. I'm afraid of the university professor from across the street. He scares me much more than those because he's weakening our ability to do anything and could overtake us, right? These people could take over the country. They have, right? In many respects, right?
Yep. Can we go back to Gaza?
Yes.
You said you have to crush the enemy, so you have to crush Gaza. When I look at it from a distance, I think Gaza is almost destroyed totally. So my question is, what could the Israelis do more than what they've already done? The second question is, do you believe in decisive operations in which you take out the leaders instead of bombing the whole people?
So what could Israel have done? It should have done everything it's done much faster and in much deadlier, much more destructive way. It should never have allowed food into the Gaza. It should have cut off electricity on October 8th and water on October. I mean, should have never given it to them. But you know, they're the enemy. Why are you feeding? You know, why are you providing water and electricity to them? They should have cut them off completely, isolated them completely, and then just devastated them. And I don't believe in just picking off the leaders. I don't think that helps. Every leader who's picked off, there's immediately a replacement. And this has been going on for 40 years, 30 years. They killed the kid. The guy who founded Hamas was killed in the 1990s. Immediately somebody replaced him. You can't. This is an ideology that is well established within the culture, and you can't just pick off leaders because they have replacements. How many? This is the question. And it's a horrible question to ask, but it's the question: how many people do you have to kill for them to actually get the idea that they're defeated, they're finished? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but a lot more than were being killed. I mean, this will go down as the war in which fewer civilian casualties have died than any other war in urban war, certainly in urban warfare, but in any warfare. Certainly per kilogram of explosives being detonated. I mean, Israel's killed almost nobody. And the consequences are the Hamas, the Palestinian population still think they can win. If you ask people in the West Bank, do they support Hamas? Yes, they still support Hamas. They still think they can win. They still think they can survive. Because, the population, Israel's accused of genocide. The population of Gaza has actually increased over the last year. That is, more children were born than Israel has killed adults, right? Or children, or whatever, whoever they've killed, right? So the population is actually growing. This is kind of the worst genocide that anybody's ever tried to do, when the population actually grows, doesn't shrink. I mean, it's horrible that we even have to talk about these things, but that's a reality, and everything's so perverted. So no, it needed to be flattened much. I mean, Israel's done an amazing job in taking very few casualties, and the military is amazing. But the reality is, they go into a place, they supposedly clean it out, they leave, Hamas reappears, they have to go back in, clean it up, leave. You can't win that way. And so some places they've gone in 5 times and they're still popping up out of nowhere because they recruit new people. They train 16-year-olds. They train them again. You have to crush the spirit of these people.
So your solution is crush the whole Gaza.
You got to. I think in the end, fewer people die.
So you are prepared to accept that everybody dies?
Everybody's what?
Everybody dies.
No, I don't think you have to kill 2 million people. I don't know how many people you have to kill, but it's nowhere near 2 million people. You have to give them the sense that their lives, they could die at any moment. You have to give them the sense that Israel is willing to kill them. And, at some point they will say, enough, we've given up.
But you're serious that you think that they don't have this sense now? That they don't see that they are being killed?
Look, Israel just offered $5 million to anybody who's willing to give information about where the hostages are. They have to be thousands of Palestinians who know where the hostages are, right? Because they're embedded in them. They're right there. Not a single person has come forward to give information. $5 million. And Israel says, we'll give you a new identity. We'll put you somewhere else in the world. Hamas will never get to you. We'll protect your life. We'll give you $5 million. It's a lot of money, right? And nobody's come forward. So that tells you something about they want the hostages. They want to keep them. And it's 2 million people. So have they figured it out? No. They haven't figured it out yet. They'll start again. They're not defeated yet. And if you look at surveys, if you look at questionnaires, Do you support Hamas? Anonymous. Nobody will find who they are. They support Hamas. They continue to support Hamas. Israel has not defeated them. Not psychologically. Maybe they defeated them militarily. Not psychologically. It's amazing. Yeah, I see it. The resilience of people, the willingness of people to commit suicide, to destroy their own lives in the name of an ideology. But it's there. It's like those Japanese who believed that they still had to hold on to that island no matter what. And they were going to fight this war, even if they, even if they died and all the other troops who died, they were going to hold the island, no matter, even though it was obvious they were going to lose.
Yeah, well, there's a big difference, I think, between Nazism and the Japanese you're mentioning. If you look at this particular ideology, it's based on religion, which is way different. So I think if you crush them, you make them believe they can't win anymore. They still have the sense that this is the way they need to behave to go to heaven or that kind of thing. So how do you think this will work? Because I don't think you can crush their ideology this way.
So I think you can. I don't think there's a big difference. I think Nazism was a religion. It even had mythology. It in a sense, had a kind of an afterlife. Certainly, Japanese imperialism was a religion. I mean, the kamikaze pilots didn't believe they got 72 virgins, but they went to an afterlife where all the warriors lived, very much like old Nordic kind of mythology. Japanese imperialism was all based on Shintoism and a deep commitment to a religious view of the world. And yet, once they realized that this was not going to achieve what they were promised it was going to achieve, that this was a dead end, that they could not go anywhere, that they could not achieve anything, they switched their ideology. People change their minds. People have free will. People can change their minds. But they need, particularly if they're deeply religious, they need strong motivation. Death and destruction are strong motivation. It's the only way to change somebody's mind when they're that committed is to show them it doesn't work. And again, I'll go back to my ISIS example. When ISIS was winning, there was a lot of terrorism. A lot of people were volunteering to go die. When ISIS is losing, nobody volunteers, or very few people volunteer. And ISIS was never really crushed. It just wasn't gaining. It just lost the ground that it had made. So the same thing happens here.
Well, is it then that these people, the ideology was crushed, or more the ISIS itself? Because maybe they just go to different.
But there was no coordinating. The terrorist attacks in Europe were lone actors who were not being coordinated from overseas, who just decided that they were supportive of ISIS and they would kill a bunch of Westerners.
But if there's enough people with this ideology, they can just reunite and create something else.
Yes, that's why.
They can't have any sufficient substances, so they can do something about it.
If you crush them, then they can't reunite and can't start up again. This is what happened to Japanese and what happens to Germans. Look, it's harder because Islam is bigger and Islamism is bigger. I mean, by some measures, when you do surveys of the Islamic world, something like 20 to 30% of the Islamic world believes in an Islamic ideology, an Islamist ideology. That's 300 million people. That's a lot of people. But again, a lot of that dramatically increased after the Iranian Revolution. Because what did the Iranian Revolution show them? The Iranian Revolution was the first example in modern times of Sharia law being established over a people, of it being successful, defeating the West, because the Shah of Iran was associated with the West. So when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979, it was considered, whoa, Islamism can work. And suddenly, there was a massive boon in the creation of Islamic organizations, in terrorist organizations and other forms of organizations, and they got emboldened and they spread all over the Middle East. Right? If Iran goes, that'll take a lot of that momentum away from them.
Yeah. I think that not every Palestinian is behind Hamas, just like not every German was behind the Nazis.
That's right.
Why should then civilians in areas like Palestine suffer by a solution like bombing everything to the ground just to try and kill an ideology? Because most of them have no say in the ways Hamas acts, or it's just not. Yeah, it's not just politically incorrect. It's unethical, and women and children especially should not suffer as they do not have any influence on Hamas. They're innocent, but they already do because Israel is just bombing schools, hospitals, and other institutions.
So I don't know how innocent women are. I don't know if you've seen these videos of, there's a famous video of a woman whose baby has cancer, and she takes the baby to Israel, and they help cure the cancer. They save their baby's life, and they cure the cancer. And she turns to the camera and she says, "My goal for this baby is to be a shaheed." That is a suicide bomber who kills Jews. So I wouldn't say that this woman is innocent. I don't think she is. That Jews just saved the baby's lives, but what she wants is the baby to kill when he grows up to kill Jews. This is the ideology. This is the ideology a significant percentage of Palestinians believe in. Now, is it everybody? Of course not. Just like not everybody was a Nazi. But the reality is that when you live in a place that is ruled by evil people, you're going to suffer the consequence of their ideology. If the only way for me to defeat Hamas is for some innocents to die, then you have to kill some innocents, because there's no other way to defeat Hamas. And there is no other way. There was no way in Germany to only kill the Nazis. And if you had done that, then more Nazis would have been created. And that's what's happening in Hamas right now. Every time you kill a leader, a new leader pops up. Every time you kill somebody with a gun, a new one comes up. Now, it's horrible that children have to die. Children are truly innocent. Women might not be, but children are truly innocent. It's horrible that you have to kill children. But the fault of that is on Hamas. Hamas started a war, and the only way to defeat them, the only way to destroy them, is through war, where some children are going to die.
Did Hamas start?
Yes. If you want to ask me if you want to ask me the history, I'm happy to go through the history. But absolutely, Hamas started the war. In 2005, Israel left Gaza. Hamas could have done anything they wanted with Gaza. Israel didn't tell them what kind of state to build. They could have turned Gaza into the Hong Kong of the Mediterranean. They chose to build tunnels, to buy weapons, to launch missiles into Israel. Israel didn't attack Hamas, didn't attack the Palestinians in Gaza. Gaza as a geographic political entity Israel completely separated itself from Gaza. So who started it?
But Israel did produce these beepers, which were actually bombs, and that was years ago.
So the beepers in Hezbollah, not Hamas. Beepers were in Lebanon, not Hamas. Hezbollah is an enemy of Israel, trying to bomb Israel, trying to kill Israelis. They produced beepers in order to attack their enemy, not in that particular, not because they knew this war would happen, but because they knew a war would happen, because Hezbollah is committed to war with Israel. So they built beepers in order for one day, when the war comes, they'll have a strategic advantage over them. But Hezbollah has been attacking Israel regularly. Hezbollah started to attack Israel in 1983. We're talking about 40 years of a war initiated by Hezbollah. We're not talking about yesterday, it started. This is 40 years of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in Lebanon. What do they have against Israel anyway?
Yeah.
So, if I understand correctly, you're arguing to start killing hundreds of thousands of people. If I understand correctly. But I might be wrong here, but I don't think that's how we won the Second World War.
How did you win the Second World War?
Well, not by killing hundreds of thousands.
Really? You should study the Second World War then. So for example, when the Allies invaded northern France, when they invaded France, what do you think they did before the invasion actually occurred? Every town along the northern coast of France was bombed, basically into oblivion. Who died there? Some Nazis. Mostly French people died there. Hundreds of thousands of French died in the invasion of France. Not by the Nazis, by the Americans and the British and the French themselves.
That's true, but still, I don't think the Allied forces killed more innocent people in the Second World War than the Nazis.
I haven't run the numbers, but it could very well be, but it's not a numbers game. My point is not how many people you kill. The point is you have to make it clear to the enemy that they cannot be successful under any circumstance. If that means killing one person, great, only kill one person. If it means killing more than that, then you kill as many as necessary to end the war. As long as they believe they can be successful in the future, the war never ends. And the war is not ended. We've been going at it for 70 years, 80 years, 100 years, right? And it's not ended, just what everybody calls a cycle of violence. But the way to end that cycle of violence is for one party to defeat the other party.
So more violence.
To end the violence, you cannot end a cycle of violence without more violence, yes.
But then doesn't that just start another cycle of violence? Because systematically killing hundreds of thousands.
So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, did that end the violence? Or did it start new violence? The Japanese now regularly kill Americans because they're upset about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? No. It ended the violence, and it ended it for good. Right? Overwhelming force ends violence.
Yes, nuclear bombs, but...
Okay. So did flattening of Dresden in American occupation of Berlin and Russian occupation of Berlin, which is even more brutal. Then that ended German aggression. Ended German aggression. Violence ended aggression. Violence, you know, at the end of the day, you don't get peace until one side beats the other.
That's the problem in Ukraine. We have been too soft. As a result, Russia have gone. So we, as Europe, have wasted hundreds of thousands of lives of Russians and Ukrainians by being very soft in the middle and said, oh, we can't be too hard on Russia. No, we should have been brutal back. Beating it out, it's gone and done.
I mean, the challenge you have with Russia is they have nukes. That doesn't exist elsewhere in the world, so it's a challenge. But it's absolutely true. You can't, there's never been lasting peace generated by a compromise between the good guys and the bad guys. I mean, I'm open to being proved wrong. Yeah.
Okay, so earlier you said Gaza couldn't become the Hong Kong of the Middle East. You also said that water and electricity should have been cut off much earlier,
yes.
And Gaza has been blockaded by Israel for a while. As you become a wealthy and prosperous nation with those really not very fortunate?
Gaza didn't have to be blockaded. Gaza brought the blockade on itself. If you sit there and you launch rockets into your neighbor, the neighbor is not going to allow weapons systems to come into your country. So the blockade was an interesting blockade before the war. Gazans would come into Israel to work. Over 100,000 Gazans came into Israel to work. That's how big the blockade was. Food would go into Gaza. Water would go into Gaza. Electricity would go into Gaza from Israel. It's not a blockade exactly. They got billions and billions and billions of dollars from Kuwait and from Qatar and from all these countries. They could have built anything. They could have built beaches and hotels. Israel would have said, cool, we don't want to blockade you for the sake of blockading. The only reason they were blockaded is because weapons were being smuggled in order to attack Israel. If your neighbor is smuggling weapons to try to kill you, yeah, blockading is the least thing you should do against them.
Yeah. With the solution of first destroying and then giving an alternative, what alternative should Israel give? Because the example of Japan, they got their own states back.
Yeah.
So that's a two-state solution.
Yeah, I think there are two options that Israel would embrace in a circumstance like that. One's a two-state solution, one's a one-state solution. But the two-state solution, I have nothing against a two-state solution. Most Israelis would give a thumbs up to a two-state solution tomorrow if they believe the Palestinians are willing to establish a relatively free, a state that is focused on progress and advancements and prosperity and things like that instead of war. If the Palestinians are committed to war, which they are and have been, and they haven't shown any indication otherwise, then Israel cannot allow for a two-state solution because that would put the Gaza Strip 5 miles from Tel Aviv. So it would make October 7th a cakewalk as compared to what was coming in the future. So once the Palestinians are committed to an actual peaceful, productive country, there's no problem with the two-state solution. On the other hand, once they're committed to that, there's also no problem with one-state solution. Have them integrate into Israel, give them full equal rights together with Israelis. They can vote, they can do everything else. And there's a one-state solution. Either one is fine. Nobody's, people are not objecting to these solutions as long as the Palestinians are willing to be peaceful. As long as they're committed to violence, there is no solution.
Yes, so you said earlier that a lasting peace requires two steps. First, military, physical defeat.
Yes.
And the second step is an ideological alternative to what they have now.
Yes.
Talking about that second point, after you crushed Hamas and Islamic extremism in the region, a big difference that I see that we saw, for example, in Japan or in Germany, is that the Germans and the Japanese were included in that alternative ideology. And they were taken up in the West. They were part of the story of that new alternative.
No, they weren't. They weren't. The Japanese, the only piece in the Japanese constitution that's Japanese is the emperor. But there's no other piece of Japan in the Japanese constitution. Yes, yes. Agree, absolutely. In that sense, absolutely, yes.
My question to you is, will Israel be able to pose an alternative ideology, or do they need the West, willing Arab countries, in order to tell the Palestinians that they are part of the new ideology?
So this partially depends on whether Iran is still around, and Iran spending money in order to undermine the this Western liberalism that Israel might offer to the Palestinians. As long as they're around trying to undermine it, it's going to be very difficult, or other Arab countries that might be undermining it. And this also depends on whether the Palestinians feel defeated and open to this new ideology. But yes, I think Israel can offer a Western vision. I think Israel is such a Western liberal country. I mean, it's exactly what Israel is. So all the Palestinians have to do is copy Israel.
And what would be the role of willing Arab countries in the neighborhood, like for example the Gulf states, which a couple of years ago signed the Abraham Accords with Israel?
Yeah.
I mean, I think their role would be to do a Marshall's Plan, right? So basically provide the financing for the rebuilding of Gaza and rebuilding of the West Bank and creating the economic opportunity that begin, that will thrive under Western liberalism. But without the Western liberalism, the money won't do anything. The money is only of value if you also have a Western liberal, political system to go with the money. So the Gulf states can, they're not going to, this is the problem. They're not going to be happy about the Western liberalism, right? Because they're not Western liberal countries. Dubai is not a Western liberal place. You might go there and be fooled by it, but it's not. It's an authoritarian state, which presents a Disneyland for Western visitors, but lives in an alternative universe. But they could certainly provide the funding to make it all possible. They did, right? They provided the funding for Hamas all these years. Hamas used it not to establish a Western liberal society. They used it in order to buy weapons and to build tunnels and to build up their ability to aggress against Israel. And that's what cannot be allowed.
Yeah. Let's turn it around. What if Putin uses this solution? What if he just bombs Ukraine all the way to the ground? It will not be the end of the war. It will be the start of World War III, right?
No, I don't know. I mean, this whole new concept of World War III, I think, is bizarre. I don't think we're heading towards World War III. Putin is trying to do exactly that. He just said that he's targeting all of Kiev and he's going to try to flatten it. He's tried to do that from the beginning of the war. The bad guys never have a problem trying to flatten and destroy their enemy. He has continuously targeted civilians in Ukraine and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine constantly. But look, there is a difference between good guys and bad guys. And, bad guys will always try to kill as many people as they can. And they do it for the same reason. They're trying to subjugate the population. If Putin flattens Ukraine, you think the West will intervene? There'll be no Third World War. They'll just give up Ukraine and hand it over to Putin. He'll win, which is exactly my point. That's how you win, whether we like it or not. That leads to victory. Yeah.
In doing that, why would you still be the good guys? Because you are also killing millions of people.
Because the good guys, bad guys is not determined by how many people or what people you kill. Good guys and bad guys is determined by what you're fighting for and who started the war.
Well, yes, but in a war, are there even good guys? Because either side is killing hundreds of thousands of people.
That's why I said the standard of good guys and bad guys is not how many people you kill, not who you kill, but what you're fighting for and who started the war. If you start a war, you're the bad guy by definition. Putin's a bad guy by definition. He started the war. The Hamas is bad guy by definition. They started the war. The second aspect is, what are you fighting for? If you're fighting like Putin, to establish authority, dictatorial authority over people, you're the bad guy by definition. If you're fighting a war in order to establish freedom, in order to liberate a people, you're the good guy by definition. So it's not an issue. We don't count bodies in World War II and say the Allies were the good guys and the Nazis were the bad guys because the Allies killed fewer people. That's not the standard by which we evaluate. Nazis started the war, and the Nazis wanted to bring oppression and totalitarianism to the world, and the Allies were fighting for freedom, and they were fighting in their own self-defense. That's what makes them good guys, not how many people they killed or didn't kill. It's also, I would say, it's the gratuitousness of it, right? The Allies killed a lot of Germans, a lot of Germans. They didn't set up industrial camps by which to kill them. They didn't rape and pillage for the sake of raping and pillage and filmed it all and put it up on TikTok. It's a big difference between just a mentality of an army that does that versus a mentality of an army that is trying to defend itself.
Okay, as far as I understand it, the government of Hamas is much less centralized and much more guerrilla-like.
Much more what? Much more what?
More like a guerrilla-style warfare.
A guerrilla-style warfare.
Yeah, compared to Nazi Germany and Japan. Doesn't that also make it a lot harder to adequately destroy them?
None of that is true. It's just not true. Gaza Strip had 2 million people in. It had clearly a political leadership. It clearly had its Hitler. It clearly had its Goebbels. It clearly had a whole infrastructure that ran the Gaza Strip. There was nothing, guerrilla about it. They were weak. So if you want to say Hamas are the good guys because they're weak, but no, they were weak. But that didn't make them guerrilla. They were getting huge amounts of money. They were organizing massive infrastructure projects to build tunnels to be able to get inside Israel. They were building drones and missiles and these capabilities, not guerrilla style. They were doing it as a government of a territory.
My point was more, in Germany, the Allies destroyed all the institutions eventually and replaced them.
Yes.
The question is, and those institutions were basically where Nazism was embedded. Yes. Is it possible to do that as much in Gaza?
Yes. Yes. So the fundamental institutions in Gaza are the schools, where this ideology is being taught and young kids are being trained to be suicide bombers. This is the big opposition to UNRWA, the UN organization that is doing much of the training of these young children. The institutions are government institutions where they have been authoritarian, top-down, and dictatorial. That can be replaced. And then ultimately religion. And that is a challenge. The biggest challenge is, how do you replace the religious institutions that encourage this authoritarianism? How do you replace it with, call it moderate Islam, call it some kind of reformed Islam that is more moderate? And that's where the Palestinians could get some help maybe from other Arab countries that have more moderate Islamic forces. But it's the same institutions have to be replaced.
Yaron, we have to stop for now. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for this long interview. I think it's fantastic that we have been able to discuss in what you say. It's always controversial what I say, and we didn't have any fight in here, so that's already a win. So that's great. I'd like to invite you all to Mandeville now, because I think we rented this place till 6 o'clock, so we're nearly there. And then we can have a drink, and we also have a little bit of program later on. So everybody is invited to Mandeville. But before that, I have 2 remarks. This whole idea that why I invited everybody is that I like to say something positive about Ayn Rand, but you begin loving Ayn Rand by reading her novels. And for those of you who don't have read her books or don't have the in possession, I have put 2 major ones on the table in the back, so you can take one of the Fountainhead, the one of Atlas Shrugged, and I think this is fantastic reading for those who haven't started. And the second point, I promised to give Jonathan a few minutes to express how you can even learn more about Ayn Rand and objectivism.
Thank you, Jan. It's been so great to come here, second year in a row. It's really fantastic, and thank you all for joining us. Also, thank you for Robert for sponsoring the books, and you also did it last year, so very generous of you. Just two things. My friends are handing you now flyers for free digital books that you can also get, all of the literature besides of what we have over there. So it's meant for students. It's one of our programs at the Yaron Institute. So if you have somebody you wish to give a book for free, you can use the link there. And the second thing, they're handing out flyers for the Ayn Rand conference we're having in Berlin in März next year. It's going to be a weekend where we discuss these ideas in a very profound way. It's going to be mostly oriented about Rand's approach to politics. So a lot of what we talked about, individual rights here, capitalism, and those things. So we offer scholarships. So at the flyer, you can apply for a scholarship, especially if you have read any of Rand's books previously. It's very good for you. If you're an adult and can pay for your own way, you can also very much encourage to do that on our website. So hopefully I'll see you in Berlin and to many more times here in Gouda. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks again for coming, and let's have a drink to celebrate this fantastic new material to work out with each other.